The three organizations had done research together and published end of 2020 a report called Life Exposed. It's a very well written report, well documented. It contains many facts, many touching, shocking quotes of Palestinians whose homes had been invaded by soldiers, and also quotes by the soldiers themselves, by some of the soldiers. It's all about trauma, fear, and abuse of power. Yeah, most of us feel safe in our homes. As night falls, we turn out the lights, close the doors, and gather inside with our families, safe in the knowledge that within our four walls we are protected from the world outside. The knowledge that when our door is closed, no one can invade our private space without our permission enables the peace of mind and comfort we feel at home. This sense of security is stolen from Palestinians in the West Bank, where almost every night throughout the area, armed Israeli soldiers raid Palestinian homes. This is how the introduction of the report starts. I think it's very important that these aspects of the occupation are documented and distributed among general public, politicians, decision makers. And by sharing these facts, spreading the word, we will better be able to let people know what's going on in occupied territories and to change policies. In the Netherlands, we just have had parliamentary elections. Many former spokespersons on foreign affairs have left, new ones have come. Reports like this, written by esteemed organizations, will definitely help these spokespersons to get a better impression of what's happening on the ground in the occupied territories. We hope that this webinar will provide the audience new insights and also inspiration to contribute one way or another to peace and security in Israel-Palestine. We would like everyone who has questions to ask their questions through the Q&A. The webinar will last 1 hour, and yeah, the speakers will start one by one, starting with Yesh Din, with Sharona, and then afterwards Ori and Dana, breaking the silence, and Physicians for Human Rights. Yeah, first Sharona of Yesh Din. Yesh Din Volunteers for Human Rights is an Israeli non-profit organization that was established in 2005. Since then, it worked to protect the human rights of Palestinians living under Israeli armed forces occupation. Yesh Din views the occupation as a main source of the violation of the human rights and therefore seeks to end it. Sharona directs the international relations and advocacy at Yesh Din. She holds an MA in politics from Hebrew University and a BA in communication from the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. She's also contributing photographer and editor for the photography collective Active Stills. And she's on the board of Active Vision. So the mic is yours, Sharona.
Thank you, Gerard. And thank you both Gerard and Thomas for organizing this event. And also for all of you for taking the time to hear about this important issue. First of all, I'd like to mention actually that today here in Israel is Holocaust Memorial Day, where alarms ring in the morning and everyone holds ceremonies. Yet it's important to note that the very principles of international law and human rights are connected to principles passed after World War II following the atrocities committed against the Jewish people and other peoples. And these principles are not anti-Semitic. They were instead created to prevent the incentivizing of wars of aggression and exploitation and to prevent other such future atrocities. So Israel's flouting of these principles actually renders them somewhat meaningless and strengthens racism, fascism, and lawlessness worldwide, including strengthening the very voices who promote anti-Semitism. Regarding our report, our three organizations embarked on this project after recognizing that forced home invasions are one of the defining issues that are affecting Palestinians' lives under Israel's ongoing occupation, an issue that has dire consequences for Palestinian society as a whole and for individuals. And it's one of a number of tools that Israel is using to control Palestinian lives and maintain dominance. Yet it's an issue that's had very little research or advocacy conducted. The report is based on 80 testimonies collected from Israeli soldiers, which Ori will discuss more, and over 150 testimonies of Palestinians who experienced this phenomenon. For most of us, though, as Gerard said, the home is our refuge, a safe and intimate space that we control. We don't expect it to be invaded or entered without our permission. For this reason, in most democratic countries that hold even the most basic principles of rights, invading homes is limited to the most exceptional circumstances, requiring warrants and judicial review. However, for Palestinians in the West Bank, this is far from the case, and most Palestinians have experienced at least one home invasion. Palestinians know their home is liable to be invaded at any time, and the military authorities require no warrants or judicial review. According to UN OSHA figures, there are an average of 267 search or arrest operations per month in homes. Our research reveals that these invasions are carried out for a few primary reasons: searches, arrests, so-called mapping to document the features of the home and its inhabitants, and seizure of the home for operational needs, such as to use as a shooting post or a base of sorts. The majority of West Bank Palestinians have actually experienced not only one home invasion, but what we found was that most had experienced multiple, with 67% of families stating that soldiers have entered their homes more than once. 88% of these invasions were carried out between midnight and 5 a.m. These nocturnal invasions exacerbate harm to families who are awakened from their beds to soldiers. As you can imagine, children being awoken by soldiers with guns as they sleep is very traumatic, an issue which Donna will go into further. The average duration of a home invasion is 80 minutes. The military legal framework that Israel is operating under, according to the laws of occupation, is also insufficient in addressing this issue. It contributes to a framework allowing soldiers to use the arbitrary use of force, and is very permissive in allowing very little grounds to enter and no judicial review. An issue that we actually filed a petition in the high courts to challenging the practice of home invasions for search and arrest warrants, and without any warrant and without judicial review, demanding that this be reformed, and also demanding that the Army explain their policies regarding the issue. Unfortunately, the Army has not been forthcoming with most of the information. They provided a little bit, but the proceedings are ongoing and we are still challenging this. In addition to searches and arrests without warrants, the practice of mapping is another issue that significantly harms the human rights of inhabitants. It's often carried out for intelligence purposes, simply to gather information on a structure and/or its inhabitants. These actions in particularly violate the dignity of occupants by collecting private information about a subset of the population that's not suspected of any particular offense, utterly violating any right to privacy. These mappings actually have no legal basis, both in military or international law, and often are conducted simply to make the military's presence felt, according to testimonies, or even in communities where they're trying to deter them from participating in demonstrations and other acts of dissent. Which is also another reason that many home raids are conducted. It's often connected to collective punishment when there are communities that are beginning to express dissent, for instance, against outposts being built. We'll find that there's an increase in home raids. We are continuing to stress that the prioritization of military needs over human rights is leading to widespread impacts on Palestinian society. And this is none the more evident than in the practice of home invasions. Another issue that we would like to raise is that this is a discriminatory practice. Israeli settlers who also live in occupied territory are not subject to the same home invasions for many of the same suspected activities, such as throwing stones. For Israeli police to enter their homes, it requires a warrant and it's subject to judicial review. And it is not as widespread, anywhere near as widespread as is occurring with Palestinians. Overall, this actually highlights something that at Yesh Din we recently released a legal opinion on, which is the fact that the West Bank is under a current regime of apartheid, in which Israel is pushing Palestinians into less and less space with no political and civil rights, and in which there's an attempt to dominate and control their day-to-day lives, and by using measures like this that are intimidating and not allowing for any legal way to express dissent against the policies and control that they're suffering under. And I think I will pass it on to Donna, or to Donna, or to Ori, sorry.
Go ahead, Ori.
Yeah. Thank you, Sharona, and thank you everyone for being here, and of course for the organizers. My name is Ori Givati. I'm the advocacy director of Breaking in the Silence. Basically, we are an organization of veteran soldiers who served in the occupied territories since the beginning of the Second Intifada, formed in 2004, and we work to bring our testimonies of the reality of the occupation to anyone who is willing to listen. Now, about home invasions, I would like to emphasize three main points that are specifically important from our point of view as soldiers who conducted these type of missions. And the first one is that home invasions are done behind the curtains. They are done in the middle of the night. No one sees them. They are not a checkpoint or a protest or a patrol that a lot of people who talk about occupation know about. And with that, they are one of the most central elements of the way we control the Palestinian people. And that is very important to understand. Usually when we talk to someone about occupation, the first image that comes up to their minds will be a checkpoint. But really, checkpoints, there should also be the image of a home invasion because of the amounts of times it happens, because of the way that it's being conducted, and because of the centrality of it to the system of the occupation. Now, there is always a micro-tactic reasoning, for any type of home invasions that we do. It can be one of the types that Sharona mentioned, and there are more types like turning a home to a military post, like training. Maybe I'll talk about it later if I have time. There will always be a reasoning, but in order to really understand what's happening, we need to look on the broader perspective, and this is a strategic reasoning, and not the micro-tactic justifications. And to understand the strategic reasoning behind home invasions, I want to take us all 5 years back to the last time that I served in the occupied territories. And the first thing that my commander told me when we arrived to the area where we served in, it was an area called next to a Palestinian city called Kalkilia. He told us, our mission is to make all the Palestinians in our area feel like they cannot lift their head up. All the Palestinians in our area. He didn't say all the violent, all the dangerous, all the Hamas, all the Palestinians in our area. And this is important to understand because it takes us to the main element that is behind not only home invasions, but many of the missions we conduct in the occupied territories. And home invasion is one of them. And that element is making our presence felt. Okay? How will we control the Palestinian people? We know in different ways, that we are in charge, right? Different units call it differently. So in my unit, it was letting them know that they cannot lift their head up. Other units call it making the entire population feel like they are being chased. There is another, we hear from our testimonies, another type of the same element, which is to instill fear in the Palestinian population, okay? And it's very important to clarify that this is not my words as a left-wing organization analyzing the occupation. These are the the orders. Okay, these are the orders. We need to instill fear. These are the orders of the army. And we still hear it until today in different shapes and forms. Okay? And I'm saying all of this to clearly state that home invasions are not a singular case, and they are not isolated, and they are not the initiative of a, let's say, a violent commander or a racist soldiers in the army. It's not the case. Home invasions are an integral part of the system of the occupation because they are used to make the Palestinians feel like they're being chased. Yeah? When you're a Palestinian and you don't know what will happen in the middle of the night in your own home, yeah? This is one of the ways we make our presence felt and make the Palestinians in our area feel like they cannot lift their head up. Yeah? Personally, I can tell you that I always have this flashback every time I talk about home invasions because I really remember this command that I was given myself. The last thing I want to say is that this report was extremely important for us as former soldiers because we, in Breaking the Silence, always spoke about home invasions. Yeah, it's one of the central missions that we were sent to do. But for us, the home invasion ends when we leave the home. So we go in, we stay there for 1 hour, we stay there for half an hour, soldiers stay there for sometimes a bit more, but eventually we leave and we close the door behind us. For the Palestinians, and this is what we learned from this report, many of those invasions never end. And it was a great opportunity for us to understand it, and we think this is one of the most important parts of the report. And I will let Dana emphasize on this issue more. Thank you.
Thanks, Ori. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to share, try and share presentation. Doesn't quite work. So I'm going to read out a testimony from a 7-year-old girl as narrated to us by her mother. When the soldiers beat me in front of F's eyes, F is the 7-year-old girl, and I had a nervous breakdown, my husband took me to the hospital and F stayed with their siblings at home. They told me that they had gone looking for her and found her on the 2nd floor at the kitchen window, trying to throw herself down. When I spoke to her, she told me she thought I had died and wanted to die to join me. I told her I was fine and that I was near her. This is one example of the mental health impact of forcible home invasions, and I'll be speaking about them as potentially traumatic events, and I'll be noting the post-traumatic stress symptoms that cause such significant harm to children and adults that we, Physicians for Human Rights Israel, saw on the ground. And our focus really was on the question of what happens when the quiet of the middle of the night is suddenly shattered by armed soldiers often occupying power that enter the home. Physicians for Human Rights Israel, or PHRI, focuses on the right to health of all those under the responsibility of the Israeli government, and we do our work together with 3,000 volunteers, primarily healthcare workers. And our role here was to bring in our mental health expertise to the discussion of what these events mean. And so to do this, we established a committee of mental health experts who carried out the interview design and the interview analysis. And we interviewed 31 women and men who are parents to 41 children. We did not interview the children directly to prevent re-traumatization. And we really tried to keep an open platform for expression. And I have to say that even for these very experienced mental health professionals, reading these interviews was very, very difficult. Our findings based on these responses were that these invasions into the victim's private space, accompanied by threats of violence, sometimes actual violence, are, as I mentioned, potentially traumatic events. Now, what is emotional trauma? What happens when we come face to face with a stronger power from which we cannot protect ourselves? Traumatic events cause deep physical, emotional, and cognitive changes. They cause changes in memory. They dissolve the sufferer's sense of safety and security in their surroundings, akin to other traumatic events, sexual assaults, robbery, car accidents, etc. And I have to add that there's a different element here in that these are repeat events. They either happen to you repeatedly. I think Sharona mentioned that 64% of the cases, they happen more than one time to a family, or they happen to your neighbors, other people in your village. And of course, you keep having the contact with the traumatizing agents, namely the soldiers. Now, just to break down a bit more into what the experience of a traumatic event is, loss of control is at the heart of any traumatic event. And that's really the sensation and experience that was reported by most of the testifiers. Loss of control combined with fear for their lives, fear for their children's lives. When people spoke about the soldiers, they spoke in terms such as machines, unfeeling, inhuman, which really pointed to a sense of helplessness and powerlessness over the situation, which exacerbates any anxiety involved, which increases the likelihood of post-traumatic stress symptoms happening. And this loss of control remained long after the invasion took place. So you have parents who experience helplessness in their parental role, and then you have the children who see their parents as helpless. I want to read one more testimony of a woman from the village of Hazun. They broke into my house 10 times, and each time they arrested one of my sons. I have no sense of security inside the house. My husband and I sleep in the veranda rather than the bedroom, so we can hear any movement or the sound of dogs and know that the army is here. I keep worrying they will raid the house again. I keep my clothes next to me all night, and I cannot fall asleep after 1 a.m. And I want to do deep dive into one of the post-traumatic symptoms that we saw, which is hyperarousal. It's something that we clearly saw in every testimony. It's a state in which the body is on permanent alert, as if the danger can return at any given moment. In many cases, the testifiers spoke about the triggers that remind them of the invasion, that evoke the fears and sensations they felt during the original event, particularly at night. Hand in hand with that come sleep disruptions. Now, sleep disruptions interfere with sufferers' lives, can impede ability to function. When they're prolonged, they take a heavy toll on physical and mental well-being. And just like the testimony I read, a lot of the testifiers spoke about staying awake around 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. when the soldiers first came, only falling back to sleep at the sound of the Kor Meuzin, which marked when the soldiers first left, waking up each time they heard a noise outside or a car drove past, and so on and so forth. And this is one of the aspects that we saw, but I also want to use the time to speak specifically about the impact on children, because with children, the experience of trauma can result in impaired development, specifically when you speak of younger children. And this is because, compared to adults, children have a much greater difficulty understanding and containing such emotionally extreme occurrences. And then you have the parents who have experienced distress, either during the invasion or during other aspects of life under occupation, and that impairs their capacity to give their children the sense of security that their children need. And again, the children feel that their parents aren't able to protect them. Now, among the things that we saw in children were hyperarousal, sleep disruptions. We saw anxiety and physical symptoms. We have 5-year-olds that complain of stomach aches. And these symptoms are a physical translation of the negative emotions that the children have, but have difficulty processing, verbally expressing. We saw aggression, the breaking of toys. One case that was after seeing a father having been beaten by soldiers. We saw bedwetting. And we saw in general, regression that was expressed through increased dependency on parents and the desire to remain close to parents, which in some cases impacted the children's ability to participate in school and in social activities regularly. When we say desire to remain close to the parents, you have teenagers who want to sleep in the same bed as the parents refuse, they hide under the covers with the light on, children who don't want to leave their parents' side. And I want to cycle back to the case of 7-year-old F, which I mentioned at the beginning. F continued to speak about the fear and the pain of losing her mother for months after the original event. She remained dependent on her mother. She cried often. She was fearful when her mother was away. She refused to go to school. The parents had to secure tutoring. And this is one aspect of the impact. And I want to say that, there's beyond the impact on the individual, there's an impact on the family and the society at large. There are a sense of being at home and feeling at home, and how that impacts interpersonal relations, both among the family members and among members of the community. And of course, here we're talking about, especially for children, higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder than you see in other contexts because of the everyday impact of the occupation, and this is another element of it. So to summarize, if there's one thing I want you to take away from this, is that forcible home invasions are potentially traumatizing events with extensive negative mental health impact. And to recover from potentially traumatizing events, you need treatment and you need to have a sense of safety. You can't have that when these events keep recurring to you, your neighbors, and your community. And this impacts proper recovery, both for the individual and for the community at large. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the clear elaborations on the situation from different points of view. I think that's very helpful, and I would recommend to everybody who's following now this webinar anyway to read the report, because it's there's actually a summary for those who have less time, and a very interesting report itself is many quotes, many good examples. So I would definitely recommend it. I think it's not by coincidence. I think that we have had, I think in November, December, several reports also about the detention, also from other organizations like Hamoket, like B'Tselem Save the Children, about these topics. So this is also what we shared them already by that time also with our members of parliament, also to make them aware of what's going on. So, and I think it's very important that this is shared. So thanks again. We're getting some questions coming in. The first one is for Ori. Are there many ex-soldiers who speak about these issues, such as the home invasions, openly? So yeah, is it possible? And yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Gerard. Yes, look, because of the amounts of home invasions, yeah, we show in the report 267 a month, only searches and arrests, and we know about so many other types of home invasions, yeah, mappings and that Sharona mentioned. We also, just as an example, hear a lot about training, yeah. So there is a mission called mock arrest, which is a group of fully armed soldiers in the middle of the night invade a Palestinian home, arrest one of the family members, take them out of the home, and after a few minutes and after a few hours, bring them back. Because this home is not a home of someone who is violent or is wanted or anything like that. Is a home and family that and the arrest is conducted as a training for the future arrests. Okay, so just another example that is not part of the count of the 267. So we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of invasions every month. Basically, every soldier, every combat soldier, yeah, who served in the occupied territories is most likely to take part in these kind of missions. And that's why in the interviews for this report, and by the way, just to mention, in my prior position, Breaking the Silence, I was an interviewer. So I did all the interviews for this report. Most soldiers we meet and serve as combat soldiers talk about home invasions. Okay, so yes, like many, we have more than 1,200 testifiers in Breaking the Silence over the years. Many of them, vast majority of them were combat soldiers, took part in these kind of missions, and they speak about it. I don't like, I can speak a lot about Breaking the Silence. I'm trying to figure out how to answer the second question. But maybe just to say, basically, what we do is we take our testimonies, yeah, we are the ones who did it, who saw it, who participated actively in the occupation, and we take our testimonies to every single person who is interested, okay? And we work with diplomats, politicians, with the Israeli public, which is the center of our work, with the international public. Basically, our work aims to talk to anyone about the occupation. And of course, our aim is to bring an end to the occupation. Very important to clarify, and not to fix small issues of the occupation. So just like, that's a general answer for the second question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Ori. So, but as I understood from the report, but also from your answer, many of the testimonies had been given anonymous, and some of them open. But I assume that the ones that were mentioning their names, they were former soldiers, or they were not in the army now anymore.
Yeah, no, so yeah, about the anonymity. Look, first of all, all of our testifiers, 100% of our testifiers, we know them. Okay, we meet them, we know who they are, we know their names. They are not anonymous to us. Okay, now we publish testimonies, and all of the testimonies we publish are in anonymity. Most testimonies, because of two main reasons. Okay, the first one is that we're talking about a system. We don't believe that a soldier who participated in a training in a Palestinian home, yeah, or in a mapping, or in any other type of mission, we don't believe that it should be focused on who did it, because we all do it, and it's the system who sends us to do it. Okay, so that's the first reason. And the second reason is that, unfortunately, today in Israel, the price that you pay when you give a testimony and you to break in the silence and you talk about it openly, which some people decide to do, yeah, like me, the price you pay is extremely high. People are scared to lose their jobs. People are scared that their family will hate them, and they are scared because it happens, okay? People are scared that they will be the target of right-wing, extreme radical, settler, ultra-nationalist, right-wing organizations that try to destroy people's lives, really, not exaggerating, destroy people's lives because they are speaking openly against the occupation. And that's why many people decide to contribute to their project, speak out against the occupation, but stay anonymous. But it's extremely important to understand that all testifiers, we know them. All of our testimonies go through a very precise process of verification, and even go through the military censorship. Okay, so we don't publish their names, but the whole process is very, very thorough, and yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Ori. And yeah, we know and we understood the implications of speaking out, and that's not only for these soldiers, but also for you and your colleagues. So you're doing a great job, and yeah, very brave in speaking out in these things, because it's not easy for none of you. So thanks for all the work you're doing. But it's we get some other questions as well. One question for Dana, also about the way how I mean, you're talking about this trauma, but it's still going on. You mentioned it as well. So how can you deal with it? How can the people deal with it? How can you treat them, and how can you reassure them when the events are still going on and they're all the time still confronted with the situation, and when the invasions are happening again?
It's a great question, and you know, the steps you can take to mitigate post-traumatic stress symptoms, but of course, you know, you can't unmake this this policy, right? This policy is at the very heart of the occupation. As long as there is an occupation, there will be forcible home invasions that occur the way that they do. In terms of what we did in the scope of this project, we have a regular clinic, women's only clinic of medical healthcare workers, volunteers, where we go to a different village each month in the West Bank. And there, we offered psychological counseling and assistance for individual cases. We went specifically to villages where the initial testimonies were taken from, where we know that there are plenty of home invasions, even though these do occur all over the West Bank. We also carried out, through the Treatment and Rehabilitation Center in the West Bank, workshops for psychologists, social workers, educators, village chiefs, etc., on different models of first aid response to potentially traumatic events. And with that, we also, in the women's clinic, also gave lectures to parents, specifically to mothers, how they should react during a forcible home invasions, what they should project in front of their children, etc. But these are band-aids. I think, Ori spoke about not improving the occupation, and obviously, we can perhaps mitigate some of the worst symptoms. But again, at the heart of the issue is the ongoing human rights violations. And I mentioned that there were higher rates of post-traumatic stress in Palestinian children in general, and that's not per se related to forcible home invasions. It's part of the consequences of living under occupation.
Thanks a lot. That's clear. Another question for Sharona. What is the legal framework in which home invasions are conducted? Is there any army public policy about them?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute and didn't realize it. Yes, there is. And it's actually, as I mentioned it more in brief, but it's the legal framework that is kind of ruling that it's being carried out under is military law. And this, it's specifically, it's the permissive approval system is set forth in the order regarding security provisions. And it's important to note that under international law and under the laws of occupation, military law is indeed the framework that is governing these actions. However, international law prohibits the arbitrary infringement on the rights of individuals living under occupation and establishes that any such violation is only permissible if based on concrete suspicion, which is not the case here. Unfortunately, the local military law has established something that's a far cry from the standards that are set forth in international legal institutions by allowing very arbitrary and disproportionate violations of dignity and privacy of Palestinians, requiring very low grounds for suspicion to be able to enter a home. And as I mentioned, that this is not the case for entering Israeli settlers' homes also, which is something that's important to note. Like an Israeli settler that's living in Yitzhar, one of the most violent settlements in the West Bank, is not subject to any of these arbitrary home invasions. They're not subject to military law. They actually are subject to Israeli civil law, and they have a whole process of significant grounds for suspicion and such. A Palestinian that's living in just down the hill in the Palestinian village of Borin, it does not have those protections at all. Any of their homes can be invaded on very little grounds of suspicion, no warrants, etc. So one of the things that we are challenging is the fact that local military law is by far insufficient and does not actually adhere to the standards of international law. And in addition, the fact that international, like human rights principles are being completely ignored at the expense of military law, which is obviously not only the case with home invasions. We see this as far as various violations that are occurring under protracted occupation and apartheid, the various inhumane acts that we see as making up apartheid. Oftentimes Israel uses the security justification for many of them. But with this instance, there's not really any strong framework to challenge it, even under international law. So this is one of the challenges that we're trying to confront. So.
Yeah, and how do you see that it can be solved? I mean, most, as you mentioned already, most of the settlers are not facing consequences for them. I mean, people, Israelis living in the same area don't face the same consequences. So for the people, let's say for most of the people in Israel itself who are able to put pressure on the government or whatever, there's no reason to change it because they are not the victims of the system, while the Palestinians in occupied territories are, but they are not able to participate in the system. So, and then this combined with the fact that people who do speak out, like Ori just mentioned, are under a lot of pressure, it means that that not many people are as you are and will speak out. So how do you see the opportunities to change this system then, to get it done, and what do you expect from us, from the outside world, to support in this respect?
I can start. We did make attempts, because I see there was also a question about being accepted in Israeli society. And we did have the report heard in a special session of the Knesset. It was read by various members of Knesset. We have done a lot of media advocacy in Israel, which I think Ori can also mention a bit more. And it actually received a bit of attention. Like you said, though, there's not a huge significant interest in the Israeli public to make these changes. So with your question about what you can do, I think that there's a number of things, especially those who are in influential positions. I think continuing to legitimize the role of the ICC and the decision to investigate that. I think that that's something that's important. I think also to stress the fact that, for instance, right now the international community is praising these normalization agreements with Middle East states. To emphasize that we can't be claiming that Israel is making peace with the Middle East when Palestinians' homes are being invaded every single night, and Palestinians are subject to a regime of apartheid, etc. And that many of these normalization agreements, in the end, it comes down to money, and they're at the expense of human rights. And so I think this is something that needs to be raised. Israel, I think that those who are in the position to do so need to be really leveraging their influence to pressure Israel to end these violations. And I'll let my colleagues also.
Yeah, I think first of all, I join Sharona. The issue of the ICC, extremely important issue these days. I just saw while we spoke that Israel replied to the ICC. I haven't had a chance to read the reply, but Israel just replied to the question of whether it will cooperate or not. Anyway, so that's the first issue, and the legitimization, and also the not accepting under any circumstances the claim that the ICC is an anti-Semitic institution, or the use of anti-Semitism to attack critics of Israel. This is like one of the most dangerous issues, and it's not specifically about home invasions, but of course it's part of the problem. Now, more specifically about home invasions, what we try to do with this report, and the international community can be crucial on that, is to make that part of the system of the occupation is home invasions. So when we talk about it, it doesn't matter where, in our government, in our family dinners, yeah, whatever, we make clear that home invasions are a part of it, and they are not separated, and they are not the fault of specific individuals, but they are part of the way we control Palestinians, just like checkpoints and dispersion of protests and patrols and all of the things that people are kind of used to see.
Thank you. Dana, something to add to it?
I think my colleagues have pretty much said it all, but I want to reinforce what Sharona said in terms of the reception here. You know, we turned to the Israeli Medical Association here to ask them to speak out against this policy. In fact, they did respond that they will ask the military to take the mental health implications into account when conducting this policy, which is a step forward, but again, it's not enough, bearing in mind the extremely negative implications of soldiers entering the home at night. And I think here, you know, you really see the need, despite all the work that we've done locally, for international pressure in order to create the shift that Sharona and Ori spoke about that we need to see happening.
Okay. Another question for Ori. Are Arab Palestinians in Israel inside the Green Line completely protected against home invasions? How does it go over there?
Okay, so as far as I know, and we're not operating like breaking the silence inside the Green Line, it's way more protected when you're a citizen of Israel. But I will mention that in East Jerusalem, which is in this limbo zone, right? But according to Israel, it's an Israeli territory. Yes, we see home invasions. It's part of the life for Palestinians in East Jerusalem. And unfortunately, it's a place where we have way less information about. We are breaking the silence, So maybe, I don't know if Sharona might have more to add on.
I think as far as data and this report was dedicated to the West Bank. And so we did not really analyze or look into that issue. But I know from some of our work in East Jerusalem, recording like police offenses, it is something that's happening very frequently in East Jerusalem, even though allegedly on paper, Palestinians in East Jerusalem have similar rights as Or said to Palestinians who hold Israeli citizenship. And supposedly it requires a warrant, but oftentimes these invasions are not carried out in practice with a warrant. Also, like for instance, in the community of Isawiya, I mean, I personally witnessed quite a few home invasions as part of a group that we were monitoring certain situations that were going on in Isawiya. And I didn't see one of them that was carried out with a warrant. And we were told that that it's not our business, that this is what's happening. Also, I would say even in Palestinian communities with Palestinians who hold Israeli citizenship, it is notable to say, I don't have any figures on home invasions because that's not within our mandate, but there is significant discrimination. For instance, there's been a whole wave of protests against police violence in Al-Fahim and other areas. And we can see, it's quite clear that arrests are carried out much and violent. There's much more arbitrary use of violence. Arrests are carried out much more on a massive scale than for instance, Jewish Israelis who are protesting in front of Netanyahu's residence and such. So I think that it is still, I can't say how frequently these home raids occur, but I personally know Palestinians who hold Israeli citizenship that were arrested on the base of a post on Facebook that, for instance, was taken as possibly insightful. And I don't know of any Jewish Israelis that could claim the same. So I think we do have to note that there's still a very discriminatory approach, even with Palestinians who hold citizenship.
Yeah. There's also another question about the reasons for the home invasions. You mentioned the 4 reasons, but is it equally divided, or is one happening more often than the other, or is it really is one, let's say, more important, or how do you see it happening more often? That's also because of the reason. Yeah, I mean also because of, as I assume, also as an way to find, let's say, to end it. I assume that this is the reason behind the question.
Yeah, look, one of the other, let's say, elements of this practice of home invasions is that it's extremely arbitrary. Okay, so we see some of the invasions, yeah, will be planned, and it will like an arrest or a training that is extremely planned from a few days before, yeah, one type. But the second type would be a completely arbitrary, spontaneous home invasion. For example, testimony we have from 2012 in Tulkarem, a group of soldiers doing a walking patrol inside the city, and then just decide to enter a few homes, okay, and check IDs. It's just one example. Yeah, another example can be in Hebron. They decide to conduct the patrol, which is usually done on the street. They decide to conduct it on the rooftops. So they invade some homes and go up to the roof and do the patrol in the city of Hebron over the rooftops. So it can also be very arbitrary. And from this reason, it's extremely hard to have the data, because we have the data on some of the incidents that, by the way, on also Palestinians who are willing to cooperate, which is also hard because it puts them at risk, and that's on soldiers. So we don't have any clear data on really the numbers of every different type of invasion. So the answer is that there is no answer to this question, I think.
Yeah. Anyway, you already mentioned before that let's say one of the basic reasons anyway is to make the presence of the occupation being felt. So in fact, that's covering all four reasons already, in a way.
Yeah, I think according to our documentation and also freedom of information requests and such, it seems that searches and arrests made up the majority of the reasons given. But as Ori said, and as you just highlighted, Gerard, oftentimes it's not clear, to be quite honest. I mean, they could say it's for a search or such, but then it could actually be to make presence felt. And I think that this is where the lines get blurred into the reasonings for these.
Just an anecdote, I think, that can exemplify this. In recent testimonies, recent interviews that I conducted in recent years, I learned that actually the word arrest, in Hebrew it's ma'atzarim, it's used for any type of home invasion. So people who go do search, soldiers who go to do a search, they call it an arrest. They go to do a training, they call it an arrest. Okay, so it's very, very hard to differentiate.
I see. Yeah. So I think one last question. You published this report end of 2020. You're now like in this webinar, providing information about it, explaining about it. So what's next? What will be the follow-up? Are you going? I mean, of course, we try here in the Netherlands to see if we can inform our policymakers, members of parliament, also to put pressure and whatever. I assume that, and you mentioned already what you did inside Israel. But will you follow up? Will there be a follow-up of this report? What's going on? This is a question to all three of you, actually.
So I think for us, one of our goals is, when we speak about the occupation, there are some sort of signifiers that are internationally known, such as checkpoints. We want to make sure that home invasions, even though they happen at night, and as Ori mentioned, for that reason, they're largely invisible, we want to make it as visible and obvious a feature of the occupation as checkpoints are. And I think for that, we're asking all our partners, all the various interlocutors with whom we speak, to keep raising this issue. The more the conversation takes place, the more that the amount of house arrests or home invasions that take place may be minimized.
Thanks. Ori?
Look, first of all, look, it's a hard question, because the follow-up is we just continue doing our work, exposing the occupation, and we truly believe that it's a long process, but we are optimistic because we have to be. And we believe that the follow-up for this type of report should be education, and more education for people who already are against the occupation, but need more tools in order to fight it, and that can be a very important follow-up. Yeah, and of course we continue to monitor this and to put home invasions in the public eye. And as far as we get new testimonies about this, which happens all the time, we will of course publish them also without any relation to a specific report. Yeah, and with that, I will also say thank you so much for this event. It's been really, really great, and I'm sorry to have to leave really on time because I have another event. Thank you so much.
Same, likewise. I really appreciate both the opportunity to speak and also the great questions, the great, very thoughtful questions asked by the audience. Please do stay in touch with all of our organizations. And as Gerard mentioned, the report is available online.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just add quickly, I think Ori has to leave, but I'll add quickly as part of the follow-up. We will continue to monitor the proceedings, the High Court petition, as well as we may be filing another High Court petition challenging the practice of mapping. So, and as Donna mentioned, I think Donna also just had to leave, but we plan to try to raise this as one of the central elements of the occupation and of apartheid. So, so thank you. And I'm very sorry we had to run between various briefings, but we really appreciate your doing this and organizing this, and we appreciate everybody who attended.
Thank you, all of you. So, and yeah, Sharona, I hope to see you again here in the Netherlands, like a couple of years ago.
Yes.
Thanks all for watching this webinar. The webinar will be recorded and will be can be reviewed on the websites of the organizing organizations. So, thanks a lot. Thanks for participating, and thanks Sharona and your colleagues for giving us this insight. And I think I'm happy with the words of Ori about continue our work to expose the occupation, stay optimistic, continue working and informing and creating awareness about the situation, and then step by step we should succeed in getting things better. Yes. Thanks a lot to all, and hope to see you soon again.
And please let me know if there are any other questions or if you need anything else. Thank you.